May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free from economic hardship and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of do as little harm as possible. Today we'll have a few more pieces from a work in progress, Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki. So we'll get into that just as soon as we've had our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, if you wish, hit pause and meditate or whatever for as long as you want. And when you're ready to come back, hit unpause. And then we'll be here to hit the bell to end the meditation. And we'll get right into it. Heights. I did a lot of climbing and steep trails around Tassajara. Nothing at all risky. Some of it for fun, some on searches day and night for people who didn't come back from hikes. Did the steep climb up to Flag Rock a few times. It's not easy at all, especially toward the top. But it's not perilous as long as one goes up from the road and not from the more sheer side facing the creek and lower garden, like my son Clay in his teens did by himself, almost falling to his maybe death and coming late to dinner all scuffed up. I'd already told him that in the first year we were there, some students came back all shook up with frightening descriptions of their close calls trying to get up and then trying to get down when they couldn't go up anymore on that ascent from the upper garden. The rock up top is flat, and one can sit on it and enjoy the view from there, which is terrific. Tassajara reduced to a tiny toy settlement in a deep, bending valley surrounded by steep, mountainous terrain. There was a short flagpole at the top sporting various flags through the decades, including Tibetan prayer flags. One can exit the back way to the horse pasture trail, an easy way to get back to camp. Diane and I climbed up there once in the 60s and ate our day-off bag lunch and took a nap on the big flat rock. Hiking down from the horse pasture to Tassajara Creek, the trail follows that other little creek of phone line fame and skirts around a waterfall that dries up in the summer. It's a narrow trail carved into the side of a steep, dry, rocky incline with sharp swords of yucca to slip around. Like entering a bit of desert, biologist Sterling Bennell pointed out to me. One of the 3 ecological zones that mesh in those parts, he said. When I take that trail, I'm careful not to miss a step where I've seen Nils and Dan Welsh with their mountain goat genes scamper down its loose, sandy steepness, whooping with delight. One time, as Nils and I came to this spot from above, I remarked on this difference in our approaches to that stretch, and he said, "You are right. It's too dangerous to go that way. I will take the waterfall." I looked over. There was a trickle of water still falling down about 30 feet, 40 feet into the stony creek below. I suggested it would be more prudent for Nils to come with me on the trail, which really wasn't dangerous at all. But he feigned terror at the trail as he stepped into the creek bed above the falls. "Oh, come on, Nils, please, please, please don't," I begged, which only encouraged him to mock me more. As I walked sheepishly around, he started climbing down the face of the drop-off next to the falls. He called out how safe he felt now that he wasn't on the trail. It seemed only I, who stood on solid ground, was squeamish. He got to a spot where he couldn't go any further. I'd say he was 2 stories up there. I assumed he was going to give up and climb back up, but suddenly he leaped out to catch the branch of a tree that grew below. I about fainted. He caught it, swung down and up, and it held. We met below, where he congratulated me on conquering the harrowing trail. I am reminded of a couple of guests who had extreme fear of heights. Stan Greenberg was one. He wrote the screenplays for 2 important award-winning films: the TV docudrama Missiles of October about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the prescient Soylent Green, with land and ocean life dying out. I'd seen them both, and I didn't get many flicks in back then. I went down creek with Greenberg and his friends. He grilled me beforehand, asking if there were any heights involved. I said that one has to be careful in a few places, but almost anyone can do it. He was freaked out even before those few places. I was standing in front of him on a surface he could have hopped down to, and he was clinging desperately to the canyon wall. There are situations I've been in with heights that scared me that didn't scare whom I was with. But at least in my case, a fall could have caused damage. But he went on and on that evening in the dining room about how I'd tried to kill him. But he was still friendly with me. There was another case of acrophobia that was more extreme, more than I would have imagined possible. Some regular guests at Tassajara who always had complaints had just arrived and already were complaining. Someone came from the office to the dining room where we were setting up and asked me to please go talk to them. I was happy to, because the first thing they'd do would be to open up their portable bar. They were distressed about the behavior of the driver of a car behind them coming in, how he kept honking and past them going much too fast, almost forcing them off the road, they felt. There's nowhere to go but down. I apologized, sympathized, and said, yeah, I'd heard a car coming in pretty fast a while ago, and told them I'd chastised the driver. I had met that guy in the parking lot when he arrived. Convertible sports car, hissing steam from the radiator, reeking the odor of burned brakes. I had to talk to him again because he'd be meeting up with his accusers in the dining room and they might recognize him. He said they were going so slow it was driving him crazy and they wouldn't pull over. He explained he'd driven so fast because he was terrified of going off the road. And it is a scary road to many, especially the first time. But his solution was to drive as fast as he could to get through it as quickly as possible. We went together on a hike upstream. The walk with Greenberg was a short one downstream during a break, but this was to be a long hike on a day off, which students got every 5th day. He asked beforehand if there were any threatening heights involved, and I assured him there weren't. We headed out from the office, and he said, See that? I wouldn't want to be up there. And he pointed to the road on our right above a 5-foot stone wall. And then I saw him having trouble with that 2-foot differential between us and the stone rooms as we passed by. Went past the baths to Grasshopper Flats. He said he likes flats. Then we started up the trail that goes over the hogback, and it's a little steep, but you couldn't hurt yourself if you fell down, much more than falling down on level ground. It's not a dangerous slope. You can scoot down it. I've stood on it and cleared fallen branches for fire safety. He went, No! What are you trying to do to me? No way, man. Good Lord. And ran screaming to the bottom, a good 10 feet down the path. He still wanted to go up creek, but he said he'd just try going in the creek. I like doing that in the summer, so we walked and waded in the creek. But I worried about some places to come. We came to them, and turned out there was no cause for worry. Where we had to go from rock to rock, small or large, he had no problem. I had trouble keeping up with him. He was jumping from boulder to boulder with serious drops in between. Much, much more dangerous than taking the hogback and trails, which weren't dangerous at all. We got way up creek, sat down and ate our bag lunches. Went all the way to Church Creek Ranch. Took a few hours to get there. Visited the cave with the Indian hands and photographs painted on the wall. He said he'd read a poem by Robinson Jeffers about hands like those at Tassajara, and he'd like to see them too. We visited with a nice young couple running the place. We were each other's nearest neighbors, and it was only the 3rd time I'd met them. The couple were eager to talk, and we hung out a while. I told them about the older couple who'd been there before them. They were hospitable too, but maybe not as handy or presentable for the churches when they came to use the place. The husband was rather unkempt and unshaven. He would give me bourbon. I never liked bourbon, and it would make the return journey harder, but it was alcohol, and I didn't want to appear ungrateful. I remember him going on about how he was glad to be isolated here and away from all them grubby hippies out there. I couldn't help but say, Larry, you're grubbier than any hippie I ever met, which made his wife laugh out loud and say, Did you hear that, Larry? And repeat my words a few times, laughing more. He poured more bourbon in my glass. The young caretakers we were with that day talked about the churches, who they said were good people that mainly left them alone. The churches had started out with cattle out in Salinas back in the prior century, but in our century, which was the 20th century, the name of Bruce Church became famous for lettuce and other crops. He got the idea to ship lettuce packed in ice to the East Coast in trains. Had problems at first, but it paid off big. That made me recall Steinbeck's East of Eden, the book and the movie, which featured, among others, a guy trying to ship lettuce to the East Coast using ice. They said Bruce Church Incorporated had recently won a case in the Supreme Court that had to do with shipping cantaloupes they grew in Arizona to California. Church was a philanthropist and had given the Girl Scouts a camp over by Arroyo Seco, and I knew where that was. The young couple caretakers said there'd been a board meeting there not long ago. Cesar Chavez and his United Farm Workers Union had been giving the churches a lot of grief with boycotts and demands. There was a lot of serious talk about that at the board meeting. Then they had a party with Mexican food, Mexican beer, and tequila. For dinner, they all dressed up like farm workers, and afterwards they paraded around with protest signs that had been used by the farm workers. It was surrealistic, but must have been most therapeutic. Had a hard time pulling away. Didn't have much time before darkness. We ran back miles on the rocks in the creek to Tassajara. I had to hustle to keep up with him, who was leaping lightly. It was pretty dark by the time we got to Grasshopper Flats. The dining room crew had already taken back the food, so we ate in the kitchen. At the baths, I tried to get him to explain the difference, why he was terrified beyond belief at one type of height and oblivious of the other. He just said, "What are you talking about? They have nothing in common." Church Creek. Church Creek Ranch. There were some apple trees at Church Creek Ranch that the old couple caretakers said were going to go to waste, so a bunch of students went over there with a truck to do some apple picking. Suzuki joined them. He'd been hearing about that place. It's maybe 4 miles from Tassajara to Church Creek via trail or creek. To drive there from Tassajara, one goes about 5 miles up to the ridge and along it a ways, then back down a few miles on an even steeper and windier road to Church Creek Ranch. Tassajara's property runs along a narrow canyon. The canyon Church Creek Ranch is in is much broader, with a greater swath of sky overhead, the slopes rising more gently from there with large sandstone formations, oaks below and pines above, a meadow with thick soil, so much green, sunlight galore for the winter, and a farmhouse with a swimming pool. It provides a spacious contrast with Tassajara that was to me at first rather breathtaking. Church Creek and Tassajara had been a team up until recent times, considering their long history. Esselen Indians lived there and frequented the springs. It was rumored that Father Junipero Sierra had been to the springs but stayed at the caves. Not only are their pictographs and hand imprints on the walls of the famous cave. There's a crucifix carved into it, supposedly by Sarah. There's evidence some of the Tassajara Springs loving Esalen escaped Sarah's roundup to the Carmel Mission and hid out in the caves and rock shelters there into the 1850s. There was good reason for them to hide if they didn't want to be in the mission, as there was genocide going on, and they didn't want to end up hanging in a tree like many of their kin. The earliest white people we know of with a connection to Tassajara were trappers who actually lived at the caves, as it was called. Back when there were just trails, the caves had cattle and were providing meat and dairy products to Tassajara and places beyond. The Tassajara Road was built in the 1890s, but there was no road branching off of it and into the caves until the late 1930s, when it officially became Church Creek Ranch. Sarah Church had married Henry Arnold, who had leased the springs and made it more accommodating for those who walked and rode him with horse, camped there, and was still involved when the road and hotel were built in the late 1800s. With passing of time and the advent of roads and vehicles, Church Creek Ranch and Tassajara became much further apart. I can understand why Suzuki said what he did when he first saw Church Creek Ranch. It just seemed right they be reunited. Suzuki came from a place with countless temples and monasteries, many of which would cluster together, and he didn't dream small. He got out of the truck cab that day, turned around, looked around, took it in, and said, "Let's buy it." Sue Roberts reports, "We were all trying to be really good Zen students and work real hard and put our shoulders to the wheel and got the boxes out to pick the fruit. We were being far too serious, but only realized that when Suzuki Roshi climbed a tree and started throwing the fruit at us. The whole atmosphere broke. We got the work done and thoroughly enjoyed ourselves and each other after that." Every now and then, Suzuki would mention Church Creek Ranch in a lecture he gave at Tassajara. He was reading and commenting on the Phantasmagoric Lotus Sutra, and when he came to, quote, "the leaders of men and their disciples with neat and lovely gardens abounding with fruits and beautiful flowers," end quote, he paused and said, "Like Church Creek," and went on reading. In another lecture, Suzuki did something somewhat unusual for him. He paraphrased his disciple Claude, head monk at the time, who had told him something Buddha was reported to have said in an old sutra. 3 times removed from the source is urban myth, but it's all myth to begin with, so no problem with that. And even if what Buddha supposedly said is off, we can see what's on Suzuki's mind. The other day, Claude said that Buddha said, if you go to the mountain and find some good place to build a building, like Church Creek or the horse pasture, after you come back to your monastery, you will tell your teacher, here is a good place to practice our way. Let's build a monastery there. Then many people will go. That is my way. I don't provide any land or holy place like that. It was there. I just found it accidentally. People are very interested in that place, and that is why I have so many students. Buddha understood in that way. He did not do anything. The teaching, too, was there before he taught it, or before he discovered it. Saying goodbye. On an afternoon in late December of 1967, I was ready to go to the airport. Didn't have to be back at Tassajara till the next practice period started in January. I'd come up to San Francisco the day before and had slept on a futon in one of the apartments now occupied by the ever-expanding Zenny population. I don't remember whose room. There was always room for one of us passing through. I don't remember who was going to drive me to the airport. There was always someone happy to do that, or happy to pick you up. I hadn't gone back home for the holidays the year before because I wanted to get the grooves of the new Zen habits dug deeper. Suzuki had a flu and was in bed, and people said he wasn't seeing anyone, but I thought I'd give it a try. Katagiri gashoed with a serious smile from inside the downstairs office where he was working on a chart for the Japanese congregation's new temple fund. The building had a hollow, old, funky atmosphere without the usual swarm of warm bodies. Upstairs, I put my Zoris in the shoe rack and glanced in Suzuki's office. No one there, so I went into the Zendo, onto the polished wood floor. Even with the large altar and all its bells, statues, candles, flowers, and alcoves, the room still felt barren. The tan-woven straw goza mats with the black cloth edges were not spread out as they would be for zazen. They were folded and stacked in the corner. I went into the kitchen and looked at the wooden table with the Japanese condiments on it, an aluminum Japanese pot on the stove, and the stacks of bamboo Chinese steamers on the high shelf. There was an earthen teapot on the counter with little teacups around it like baby ducks. I went back into the Zendo, feeling uncharacteristically melancholy. "Excuse me," I said in a hesitant voice. "Nothing." I tried again a little louder, forcing a couple of coughs. "Excuse me." "Oh." I barely heard a voice coming from above. Suzuki was looking down from a window in his room that opened to the Zendo. He was in his underwear. "Hi," he said. Excuse me, Roshi. I'm sorry to bother you." How are you feeling?" "I'm getting better. I think I'll be good pretty soon." I know I shouldn't be bothering you, but I'm going to Texas for Christmas to see my mother and grandmother and sister, and I wanted to come over to say goodbye." "Oh, thank you. Are you going today?" "Yes, in about an hour. I wanted to say how much I appreciate practicing with you here at Zen Center. It's been a wonderful year, more than a year. I'm only going away for 2 weeks, but I thought I should say goodbye to you. I haven't been this close to anyone like this, a spiritual teacher, since my father died." I could see him melt away with sympathy. "I'm coming down. Let's have some tea." No, 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 you don't have to do that. I just wanted to say hi and bye. No, it's okay. I want to. Please, wait a minute. And he disappeared from the window. After a moment, he came down the narrow, steep stairs from his tiny room in the north tower and entered the zendo wearing brown slippers and a gray kimono. He was still wrapping the obi around his waist. Obviously, Oksan was gone or she'd have shooed me off. He sat looking at me, smiled, sipped his tea, then slapped the palms of his hands on his knees and made a satisfied sigh. He asked me how Tassajara was, and I said it was wonderful and peaceful. He apologized for his absence from the zendo. I apologized for bothering him again, and he repeated that he was getting better. Your practice, he said, is pretty good. You've improved a lot. The sort of thing I gathered that he'd say if someone needed encouragement. But it was nice to hear. I didn't say much. I asked him what I could do to help my mother and grandmother. Just be kind to them. Don't tell them too much about Buddhism. Just be kind to them. On the way to the airport, I thought about what Suzuki had said. Took a load off me. Reminded me of what Peter had said back at Tassajara. I told him I wanted to give my family members books for Christmas so they'd understand what I was up to, and asked what he suggested. He said he used to feel that way too, but he'd learned it's better to give them what they're interested in, not what you're interested in. On that day, I saw my teacher for a half hour before I went off on a trip. It was just a brief meeting in a plain, strange kitchen, but it sealed a trust that had been building for some time by just saying hello and goodbye and drinking a little tea in between. We deepened our ties, and he encouraged me to ease into the way of being at home with oneself without rejecting the world. So that's this week's contribution to the work in progress Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki. This has been a Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sonora with Dogga Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.